deeper and deeper. And I do believe, Meghan is driving this whole caravan for him. He is so stressed out. You can see it in his face. Despair. He's confused. He doesn't know what to say.
So frustrating, because we all know a good, successful business is one that launches and has their products available. These sold within 45 minutes, but she can spin anything in her favour. There she's saying, we were able to pull these products forward. Well, why were those products not ready to go?
Meghan Markle has dumped Prince Harry from her Netflix deal. She's the rock star now. And the Fresh Prince is gonna have to go and make his own money.
It began with silence. Not the kind that follows an argument, but the kind that settles into a room like fog, dense, unshakable, and impossible to ignore. In their Montecito estate, once alive with optimism and enterprise, the mood had shifted. The vibrant rhythm of joint interviews, shared causes, and synchronized public appearances had slowed to a dull, awkward beat. Meghan moved forward with purpose. Harry stood still, unsure whether he was being left behind or written out. The Netflix meetings had been the first clear sign. Meghan arrived alone. Not symbolically, literally. Her proposal was tight, compelling, and independent. No shared credits, no Duke of Sussex appendage. Hollywood executives were dazzled. They called her the rock star of the Sussex brand, the woman who'd turned scrutiny into strategy. And Harry? He was absent from the room, the pitch deck, and increasingly, the story. It wasn't a fight, not yet. There were no slammed doors or explosive confrontations. Just an unfamiliar quiet that lingered through breakfasts and echoed down the halls of their sprawling mansion. The children played, staff maintained routines. Meghan floated from one engagement to the next with her usual media-perfect precision. And Harry drifted. He walked the coastline in the early morning, long before the sun cleared the mist. Hoodie pulled low, headphones in, a man not hiding from the public, but from his thoughts. His gait was slow, contemplative. He'd traded castles for freedom, crowns for authenticity, and protocols for purpose. But now, he wasn't sure what any of it meant anymore. He missed structure, not the suffocating weight of royal expectations, but the clarity. In the palace, he knew who he was, even if he hated it. In Montecito, he was freer, but strangely invisible. He was no longer defined by the institution, but hadn't yet found his definition beyond it. Meghan, meanwhile, was crystallizing. Meetings, brand discussions, rebranding efforts. Her solo Netflix deal became the subject of media fascination. The headlines celebrated her return. Duchess reimagined, from palace to powerhouse. And while Meghan called it a creative shift, Harry saw the message clearly. He was no longer needed to tell this story. When the Netflix contract closed, Harry didn't protest. He congratulated her. But something in him pulled back. Not out of anger, but confusion. He'd thought they were building something together, but now it felt like she was building something beside him, and slightly ahead. He didn't raise it. He didn't want to be petty. But the small signs added up. Shared meetings becoming solo. Calendar invites with his name removed. Her voice on Zoom calls, crisp and confident, while his was increasingly muted. One evening over dinner, she mentioned a campaign idea, a new women's empowerment initiative. She listed the stakeholders, the brand partners, the potential. She looked up, surprised. You? Oh, I figured you had the kids that week. That week. As if they lived in scheduled orbit. As if they weren't in the same house. It wasn't malice, it was evolution, and it terrified him. Meghan was still his wife. They still held hands in public, smiled for photographers, spoke warmly about their values. But behind closed doors, he was beginning to feel like a guest in a kingdom he'd helped create. The team around her, publicists, strategists, media advisors, no longer asked about Harry's involvement. They didn't exclude him directly, but they no longer expected him either. At night, Harry found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering when the decision had been made, if it had been made at all. Maybe it wasn't a choice. Maybe this was just what happens when one person finds momentum and the other loses direction. He didn't blame her. Not exactly. She was doing what she did best, surviving, adapting, owning the narrative. He had admired that in her. It had drawn him to her. But now, as her spotlight grew sharper, he was fading further into the shadows. He began calling old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years, some of whom he'd distanced himself from to protect her. Late-night check-ins, soft reconnections. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet reminders that there was once another version of him, before all of this. He told no one, but he started journaling again. Pages filled with questions he couldn't answer. What happens when the dream you built with someone no longer includes you? What happens when the love story becomes a solo memoir? He hadn't left. He hadn't even spoken the words, but in his silence he was already halfway out the frame. And Montecito, for all its space and sunshine, was starting to feel very small. Not because of walls, but because of absence. The kind you feel long before anyone actually says goodbye. There were no scandals, no slammed doors, no viral clips of shouting matches behind gilded gates. Just silence. But those close to Prince Harry knew. Silence could be louder than any scream. The glow that once followed the Sussexes like a halo had dimmed. Red carpets turned cold, invitations slowed. And Harry, the once defiant prince, was slipping into something far more dangerous than obscurity. Confusion. He began pacing the beach in Montecito at odd hours, hoodie pulled low, headphones in, as if trying to drown out the noise inside his head. The man who once stood proudly before Oprah, declaring a new life of purpose and peace, now seemed lost. He had traded titles for truth, but in that exchange, somewhere along the way, he'd misplaced himself. Friends in the UK started getting calls again, quiet ones, tentative ones, check-ins from a man who had once cut all ties in the name of independence. Now, those bridges seemed less like boundaries and more like lifelines. "He doesn't know who he is anymore," one confidant whispered. "He's not the man we knew, and I don't think he knows who he's supposed to be now either." Inside the mansion, things weren't explosive. They were worse. They were still, separate wings, separate routines, conversations reduced to logistics. Gone were the moments of laughter, the spark of shared rebellion. What remained was choreography, two people moving in the same space, but no longer in sync. Meghan noticed. Of course she did. But she had always been forward-facing. She had projects to pitch, lunches to lead, narratives to control. Her world was expanding. Her solo brand, sleek, modern, unstoppable, was finding its own momentum. And Harry? He was fading. When People magazine published the article that cast her as the powerhouse and him as the dependent, it didn't just damage public perception. It detonated something private. Trust. Identity. Partnership. He hadn't seen it coming. That was what hurt the most. Not because he hadn't noticed the distance, but because he had convinced himself it didn't matter, that the foundation they built could withstand this. But when your life becomes someone else's strategy, you start to wonder if you were ever part of the blueprint or just a tool used to build it. The conversations with Meghan after the article were brief, deflective. "That's just the press," she'd shrugged. "They twist everything." But Harry had lived this life long enough to know press doesn't twist what it doesn't get handed. He didn't accuse her, he didn't cry, he just withdrew. He stopped attending pitch meetings, skipped brand sessions, began requesting solo time. The man who once couldn't bear be more than a step behind Meghan was now stepping away, quietly, purposefully. And the world noticed, not through a headline, but through absence. No shared appearances, no couple interviews, no birthday portraits with Hollywood began to whisper. Is it over? Was it always just strategy? Can love survive in the shadows of ambition? Back at the mansion, staff reported fewer interactions. Harry had become a presence without sound. He wandered, thoughtful and adrift, eyes distant. The cheerful man who once lit up rooms now seemed lit by memory alone. And Meghan? She stayed polished, perfect, ready, as if nothing had shifted at all. But something had. Harry had given up everything to be free. But now he wondered if he had simply changed the size of the cage. The walls were softer, the view was better, but the air still felt tight in his lungs. The world had once seen them as the future, as the team that would rewrite the script. But somewhere in the editing room, Harry had been written out. And he was just beginning to realize the story might go on without him. It wasn't the kind of explosion you hear, it was the kind you feel in your ribs long after the tremor has passed. People magazine hit the stands like any other glossy spread, but for Prince Harry, it detonated something deeper than public relations. It was prophecy dressed as praise, a soft focus bullet aimed straight at the center of his identity. To the world, the piece was just another flattering article about Meghan Markle. Glowing quotes, curated anecdotes, the usual mystique. But to Harry, it read like a eulogy. A farewell to his role, not as a prince, but as a partner. Not a single quote from him. Not a whisper of his voice. Just polished paragraphs positioning Meghan as the visionary, the survivor, the strategist. And Harry, a passenger. A man without a mission, adrift in her wake. For years, people had been Meghan's unofficial sanctuary. A stage on which her version of events was respectfully lit, gently amplified. So when this story arrived stripped of Harry's presence, he didn't need to ask if it was intentional. He knew. Nothing in their world happened by accident. She hadn't read it that way, she claimed when he asked. You're reading too much into it. But Harry had once studied press narratives like survival manuals. He could see the blueprint beneath the sentences. Every paragraph was a map, and it didn't include him. Inside Montecito, the reaction was not fury, it was frost. Cold detachment. The kind that creeps into the hallways of a shared life when two people begin to live as strangers. No fights, just silence. That awful, humming kind of silence that sounds like something is ending. He hadn't expected betrayal, not like this. Not from the woman he had surrendered everything for. But this wasn't betrayal of the heart. It was betrayal of presence. Of being seen, heard, respected. Even his most painful memories of royal life came back with cruel irony. He had walked away from a kingdom to become a man, not a mascot. But here he was again, invisible. Only this time he wasn't behind palace gates. He was behind her. And Meghan? She remained in motion. Always motion. If she noticed the cold between them, she didn't show it. There were meetings to take, pitches to rehearse, wardrobes to update. Her star was ascending, and it didn't seem to need orbit. Netflix, too, seemed to notice. Harry's projects, Heart of Invictus, Polo, had quietly flopped. But Meghan's name? That still sold. One executive reportedly called her the rock star of the duo, and whispers swirled of solo deals being carved, images being scrubbed clean of joint branding. She's building her world, one source close to the couple murmured, and he's just not in it. The realization sank into Harry like an anchor. This wasn't a scandal, no affairs, no blow-ups, it was worse. It was a slow, careful erasure. The kind you don't notice until you're already gone. Behind the walls of their grand home, walls that once echoed with idealism, Harry wandered. Not physically, but emotionally. He questioned everything, the Oprah special, the Spotify disaster, the documentaries. Were they ever for both of them? Or were they stepping stones on a path he hadn't realized wasn't his? He hadn't packed, he hadn't left, but the distance had already begun. Fewer shared appearances, more solo walks on the beach, late-night messages to old friends. Not cries for help, just check-ins, tentative, gentle, the way a man whispers through a door he's not sure he should knock on. And Meghan? She curated, polished, pressed forward, like a conductor in a concert only she could hear. Even friends began to ask in hushed voices, is this still a marriage or a brand whose contract expired in private? The painful part wasn't that Meghan was succeeding, it was that she was doing it without him. Prince Harry sat alone beneath the sycamore tree that shaded the edge of their Montecito estate, the ocean humming just out of sight. In his hand was a well-worn copy of his memoir, a story he once believed would change everything. But now, even his own words felt distant, like they'd been written by another version of himself, one that still believed in rescue. There was no fight, no breaking of glass, just a quiet unraveling. It came not in a scream, but in headlines that no longer needed his name. Meghan was in motion. He was in limbo. Netflix was rebranding. Meghan was their muse. The press was pivoting. Meghan was the message. And Harry? He was becoming a footnote, not a prince, not a partner, just a supporting character in someone else's redemption arc. The worst part wasn't the public fallout. It was the private mourning. For the man he used to be. For the woman he once believed stood beside him, not ahead of him. For the version of their story where they were a team, united, indivisible, revolutionary. Now everything was divisible. The mansion, his and hers. The projects, hers. The press, hers. Even the narrative of their past, now being quietly rewritten by stylists, publicists, and brand strategists, also hers. There was no scene of betrayal, no villain edit. Meghan hadn't stormed out. She hadn't slammed the door. She simply evolved. And in that evolution, she left behind the man who had lit the match to set her free. The calls Harry once ignored from old friends were now lifelines. The distant haunts of Britain, the pubs, the barracks, the cold stone steps of Windsor were no longer ghosts. They were home. He hadn't booked a flight, not yet, but he had looked. And Meghan? She was already gone in all but name. Boardrooms awaited. Cameras loved her still. Her next chapter was drafting itself with every curated quote and unshared plan. Even the promotional decks for upcoming launches had changed. No photos of the couple, just her, sleek, alone, powerful. She's not looking back, a source said. But Harry was. Not out of bitterness, but confusion, out of heartbreak. And that magazine article in People, the one that painted her as the engine and him as the accessory, hadn't just changed the public's mind. It had shattered his last illusion. She hadn't denied it. She hadn't corrected it. She'd just moved on. And so now he stood at the final page of the fairy tale, the part where the music fades and the castle isn't real, where the prince must decide, stay in the fantasy, or finally wake up. For weeks, he had hesitated. For his children, for duty, for love. But the silence had grown louder than the reasons to stay. No one talks about the moment when the fairy tale ends, not with a crash, but with a question. Who am I without her? And the cruelest truth was, he didn't know, not anymore. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to find out.